Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content.
Ten Tswewang is running. He has been running for days now, through valleys and mountains, across rivers, past ancient stone temples, and beyond acres of farmland. His determined sprint through the Himalayan mountains will cover nearly 200 miles, over 7 marathons back to back, with an elevation gain and loss similar to hiking the Grand Canyon from rim to rim twice. He will cover this distance in just 5 days. He does this because Ten Tswewang is carrying the most important news in mountaineering history. Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay have done what many thought impossible. They have summited Mount Everest. These men risked their lives to climb to the roof of the world. And now, Ten Tswewang is risking his life to run that letter the 200 miles from base camp to Kathmandu, so news of their success can be broadcast to the entire world.
Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and today we are joined by a very special guest host. We're joined by Peter Frick-Wright. Peter is a contributing editor, and he's the host of the Outside magazine's podcast, Outside Podcast. He's been a podcaster for many years. He's an award-winning writer. He's written for Outside magazine for years now, and he is here to tell us a really awesome story from the relatively recent history. Peter, thank you so much for your time and for joining us on this show. We really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Ben. Glad to be here.
And now, Peter, I read your story a couple days ago. I think it's like 3 days ago as of the time of this recording. You had posted a story, and I love mountaineering stuff. I love, reading stories, especially the early days of climbing. But you had posted a story about a relatively unknown, well, a completely unknown character who was kind of integral to the early history of climbing Mount Everest. So I read the story and I thought it was amazing. I'm excited for you to come on and tell us about it today. So the character's name, or the person's name, is Ten Tswewang. And Peter, how did you come across this story?
This is one that it was one of those things where you hear the story kind of like third hand. It was from Ten Tswewang's grandson's girlfriend at the time, and I was at a Christmas party that she had thrown. It was kind of like an industry, like she was an audio producer in Portland here, and she had thrown this party, and I was actually the only person that showed up. It's like not the greatest, like the holidays are not a great time to throw like a networking event.
Sure.
And so she and I just like talked for a couple hours. And when I said that I wrote for Outside, she was like, "Oh my God, you have to talk to my boyfriend. His name's Pemba Sherpa. And like, here's a rough kind of like broad strokes version of the story." And then I was like, "Oh my God, I have to meet with Pemba. When can we get together?" So he and I met up for a beer. He told me the story, and it was kind of just like one of those, like, this is so incredible that no one knows the story, and so perfect for Outside. Like, just give me, a couple weeks to like talk to my editors and talk to the figure out how you travel to Nepal to go report this story.
Wow. So one thing that I've been doing Badass of the Week for 15 years, I think almost 20 years now. 20 years. Yeah, it was a 20-year anniversary of Badass of the Week last month. And but I don't do any of this stuff, right? Like people will come to me sometimes and be like, "You think you're badass?" I'm like, "No, I know I'm not, because I've read stories of people who are, and I know that I'm not at that level," right? Like, but then, when I started to read your story, I was like, "Oh, this guy's kind of living it," because in order to pursue the story, you go to Nepal. But the crazy thing that I don't think you've mentioned in the story is like, because the story begins and you're in Nepal and you're tracking the story down, but you encountered the story in Portland, Oregon, like in your hometown.
In Portland in 2019, like late 2018, and then it was 2019 by the time I met up with Pemba, and yeah, like the world was a different place at that moment in history. You may remember, I thought we were just going to be able to like get on a flight and go to Nepal and track this story down. Once we got into it, it was kind of like, okay, as soon as I kind of heard this story, and we should get into like what this story is, that'll make more sense. But like Ten Tswewang had run the message that Everest had been climbed from Everest to Kathmandu. Like that's the most basic version of what he did. We'll get into like why that's so incredible a little bit later.
So when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay came down from the summit of Everest, they were the first people to summit it. The news, it's, the world's a different place in 1953. And you couldn't just text somebody that we did it or radio it in. Like you needed to, like a guy, communication was the guy had to run to a place where there was a radio tower to get the story out so that it could be broken. And that was what Ten Tswewang did. But it was a wild, like ultra marathon that he had to do to run this thing. And just an unbelievable story. We're going to get into it. But you heard about this in 2019, and then you were like compelled to track it down.
I was like, let's go do this. Pemba and I were like getting excited, riling each other up, and we're like, let's run the same route that he did. And Pemba was like, yeah, let's do that. And then so it took us about a year. Actually.
That's what I'm talking about you having like a leg up on being like reporting about badasses.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing is like I heard this story and it captured me so completely that I was like, I was a runner at the time, but not a long distance like ultra marathoner. And I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll learn to do this. Like I'll spend a year just like training to go to Nepal. And it turns out I had 4 years to train because we had to wait out the pandemic.
Right.
But it was it was not like I when I learned about the story, like I was like I think a week or 2 weeks away from having a surgery on a leg that I had broken like 2 years ago. Just to have the hardware removed. And I was like, okay, like hold up, like we probably can't go this year just because like I have to have this surgery. So it's like, we're probably going next year anyway. So then we gave ourselves permission to kind of get more detailed about our planning and like really, figure out what we wanted to do and like what steps there were along the way.
Wow. So yeah, but I love that the story was so compelling when you heard it that like, you were like, yes, I will travel to like extreme high altitude and run an ultra marathon on a broken leg.
Yeah. Well, what happened in the 4 years that it took us to actually get to Nepal was, Pemba tore his meniscus in a rock climbing accident. So he wasn't running. I had like trained up and I was running like long distance races by then. But then, so by the time we got to Nepal, it was like, okay, we don't actually need to run this whole 200-mile route. We can just trek it. Like we'll do our thing. We'll carry extra gear. We were planning on going like ultra light, just like renting rooms and houses and stuff. We carried sleeping bags. We carried, I think, a backup tent that we didn't end up needing.
But that seems like it might have actually worked out a little better because then, instead of, you didn't get the full experience that Ten Tswewang had, like running this message from Everest to Kathmandu, but you did get a little bit more time to let the experience breathe. And I wonder if that ended up working out better.
Yeah. I think we definitely got more of a sense. I mean, the other thing that was cool that we got to do was we got to start it on the day of the year that he started his run.
Oh, wow.
And so all of the, it was kind of like, okay, all of the details in the area that were happening, like I read about the blooming rhododendrons heading up to Tengboche Monastery, and it's like they would have been blooming when he was running through this valley.
Wow.
And so every little detail, but also the things that kind of drove home like just how crazy this was you started at Everest Base Camp at 17,000 feet, and it's a straight line down basically to 5,000 feet. Just like you're walking from 17, like a 12,000 foot descent that takes 2 or 3 days if you're walking it, and then you are down low, and you're at the same level that Kathmandu, the same elevation that Kathmandu is, where you're headed to, and so after that first descent, every foot that you go down, you have to then climb back up. And
wow.
so you're on this kind of and at the bottom, at that low valley, is where the route turns from kind of running along this ridgeline or along this valley that the Dudkosi River is dropping off of Everest. And then you cross the river and you just start going against the grain of like 4 mountain ranges / valleys. And you're just going up and down from 5,000 feet up to basically 12,000 feet, and then dropping back down to 5,000 feet, and then climbing back up to 12,000 feet, just like over and over again.
So the elevation gain and loss looks like a heart rate monitor.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It was like hiking, let's see, it'd be rim to rim to rim to rim to rim on the Grand Canyon.
Wow.
It was sort of the vertical equivalent.
Damn.
So yeah, 200 miles, 50,000 feet of climbing and descending roughly. And just like, hot at the bottom of these valleys, like, late May. He left on May 29th. We left on May 29th. And so, 90 degrees, 90% humidity at the bottom. But then at the top, you're at, 50 degrees and very low humidity. Like, you're back up at 12,000 feet. Like that's a high mountain pass. That's a totally different environment.
Yeah, you're climbing mountains, like multiple mountains, and descending them. So let's talk about getting to base camp, because you started at Everest Base Camp. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, we took a helicopter to Namche Bazaar, which is where Ten Tswewang was from. It's kind of the crossroads and just like the population center of the Khumbu Valley, which is where, Sherpas are from. And I mean, it's a pretty incredible place. It's at about 11,000 feet. And like, it's kind of a strategic location. Like there's a reason that it's the biggest population center in the valley, because it's the crossroads where if you grow produce down on the valley, like down in Nepal in the lowlands, and you want to sell it in Tibet, which is just like right over the mountains, and it's like closer than a lot of the rest of Nepal, you have to go through Namche. But that means you have to climb from way down below up to 11,000 feet. And then, it turns out that historically, like the Sherpas are much better at carrying goods around than people who live down low. And so that was kind of their role throughout history, was like taking produce from down below, hiking it over to Tibet, selling it, or selling it at Namche to people that had come from Tibet to buy it.
Kind of like a cowboy stop, it's like the only route through, and this is like the, last gas for X number of miles.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
These guys kind of excelled at, this was their opportunity, and this is how they got their start. And so you guys traveled there.
Yeah, we went there and then did some interviews, did some acclimatizing. We'd come from Kathmandu by helicopter. So like that's 5,000 feet to 11,000 feet. You need a couple days to adjust.
All right. Well, Peter, I'm going to have to stop you here for one sec. We are going to take a really quick commercial break, and then we come back. We're going to hear the rest of this story. All right, guys, welcome back. We are talking to Peter Frick-Wright about Ten Tswewang and his amazing adventure. And we should talk for a second about acclimatization, because that might not be a thing that's like super obvious to people. But, you were traveling because, here we have, I guess, Denver's the highest point, but you're traveling from such low elevations beginning at sea level, then Kathmandu's up high, and then you go up to 11,000 feet. We should talk for a second about what that does to people. Like, people aren't designed to move that degree of elevation at such a short period of time. You have people, there's altitude sickness is a thing that happens I don't know if you get it at 11,000. I don't know if it needs to be a little higher for you to start suffering from altitude sickness, but I've had that happen to me a few times, where you're hiking up somewhere, and then when you get to a certain point, it's like, it gets really hard to breathe because the air is so thin. You start feeling dizzy, you start feeling lightheaded. We were camping out one time and I just remember I couldn't breathe. Like, I was laying in my tent, not moving, and I couldn't breathe because the air was so thin up there. And so that is an important thing. And it is going to be important to the rest of the story too, of changing from low altitude to high altitude. And what you were saying with the Sherpas, one thing that made the Sherpas, really amazing at traversing this pass and in their work as mountaineers, is that they live at this high altitude and have adapted to it, and are able to operate completely normally in these altitudes that most people don't live at.
Yeah. I mean, like there have been since the like European climbers started showing up and trying to climb mountains, like the Sherpas have been this kind of like source of amazement for people, for climbers, because they're so good at altitude. And they've been studied more recently, and there's like a bunch of really interesting studies about the ways that their bodies have adapted. And, you know, one of the more recent studies showed that like all Sherpas have this like very rare mutation that occurs in kind of populations all around the world, but it's been named just the super athlete gene.
Oh, wow.
It just allows them to use oxygen more efficiently and more effectively than most of the rest of us. Like you can be a trained runner your whole life, you're not going to have the super athlete gene. It doesn't mean you won't be competitive, because there's a lot of things that go into that. But just from a fundamental physiological level, like it is they're on a different playing field.
Yeah. Wow. Just from living in that area for so long, or just from that's interesting. The Sherpas
came from Tibet, so they were like a tribe of religious refugees who just like were. There's actually multiple stories. They're not really sure, because all of their histories are oral, so they're not really sure like exactly what happened. But the story is that they were religious refugees facing persecution, and they left Tibet to come start living in the Khumbu Valley. Everyone else in Nepal had looked at the Khumbu Valley and been like, that's too high. Nothing grows there. It's too hard. You know, there aren't even any trees up that high. Namche is the last place where trees grow. And so like you burn yak dung, like dried yak dung for heat, like even today.
Wow.
And it's a rough life. Like you do badass of the week and just like start with any Sherpa who ever lived.
Right. I mean, I feel like I've written about quite a few Sherpas. I also like to write about the Gurkhas. I know it's a completely different tribe from a completely different part of Nepal, but like Nepal produces like per capita badasses is very high.
Very high.
And so you are in Namche in the Khumbu Valley, and I guess we should talk for a second. You're there with Ang Pemba Sherpa. So let's talk about his grandfather. Let's talk about the man Ten Tswewang, who is kind of going to be the whose trail we're going to follow. He's from this town, and what was he like?
It's really hard to say what he was like. Like most of the things that I lean on the articles are descriptions of Sherpas generally at the time. This was 1953. It was 70 years ago. We were there on the 70th anniversary of his run. Not like we only found a couple of people that remembered him, because these efforts to climb Everest, they weren't like, it's not like great like Hillary and Tenzing just showed up and tried and they did it, or like even tried a couple times. Like Great Britain had been trying to climb Everest for 30 years, and they had, like it was a process that had been delayed by World War II, maybe even World War I and World War II. I guess that timing doesn't quite work. But like they kept getting higher on the mountain as technology improved because of these wars. Like they had bottled oxygen in 1953 because during World War II, the pilots had needed bottled oxygen. And so that was something that was available.
Yeah. As of the time that Hillary and Tenzing went to make their climb to be the first people to get up to Everest, 15 people had already died trying to climb Everest. 4 of them were British and the rest were Sherpas. Most of them were from this big accident that happened in 1922. There was a big avalanche that killed several Sherpas. But yeah, 15 people had already died and nobody had made it to the top.
Yeah. It was a big deal. Like the efforts of some of the richest countries in the world, like they were given, sort of like like blank checks to go climb Everest and be the country that made it to the top first. And then in 1953, it was particularly important that one, it happened, and 2, if it happened, that news got back to London as fast as possible, because the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, that was happening as Tenzing and Hillary and the whole team, Colonel John Hunt, everybody was trying to get up the mountain. And the climbing season for Everest is like late April, early May.
So they're at the end of it's at the end of May when they actually do the climb.
Yeah. So they were waiting for a weather window. And they figured, we're getting so late into May, like it's probably gone now. And then they got the weather window and made it. And it was actually Hillary and Tenzing were the backup team.
But one thing I liked about with your story was that you said that, if they didn't make it on this climb, France was going to get the chance next year. It wasn't like now where multiple people get to climb Everest at the same time. It was like the Swiss tried, the Canadians tried, the British were trying, and then next year it was going to be France.
Yeah. Nepal gave out permits to climb Everest by the year. So you kind of like, if you missed your shot, you had to wait, 4 more years, and other people, and like Switzerland got really close. This Canadian guy got really close. Like they were not far. There's one source that I read that says like the Swiss didn't make it just because their Sherpas kind of got nervous. And they were like polite and listened to them and said, okay, we won't make it this year. Like we'll wait. But like there was a sense that like if Britain didn't make it, France was going to make it.
And the French had some really good, really experienced climbers too on the, so they were very accomplished mountaineers as well. So I mean, you read some of the stuff of Hillary and Tenzing going up there, and especially when they get to the Hillary step, they're like, we couldn't see the top of it. We couldn't really make out the details of it. Nobody had ever been up here. So we just started to climb and hope for the best. There was no route. Yeah. And then even when they get up there, they're like, all right, we did it. We took a picture. But like the snow and the wind had covered all their tracks. So they had to just remember the route down. Right. That was like another thing when they got up there, like, I don't remember how we got up here. Like, I think it's this way, but I hope so.
Yeah.
Just wild. But they do it and they get down, and when we're talking about Ten Tswewang, you have these largely European contingents coming to do the climb. And they, as you said, like the Sherpas have this great reputation of being, these kind of superhuman mountaineers, and very, very tough, very badass, very like everybody likes them. Everybody like loves working with them. But the individual Sherpas themselves don't really get the name recognition that the European climbers would have, even though these guys are up there doing even though these guys are up here doing the climbs with them. They say, it's our Sherpa. They don't name them out specifically in a lot of the early records of mountaineering. And so Ten Tswewang kind of falls into this category a little bit. We don't know a lot about his history because there wasn't a lot. His name is never really mentioned, but he was there. We saw there's like, I think you said there was like 3 frames of a newsreel with him smiling. Yeah. And he's also young when he does this, right? So one of the things that's going to happen here is he's going to run this news down to Kathmandu. And then when he gets down there, he dies a couple of weeks after delivering the news. And he's 20 years old at the time. So they're, he didn't give a lot of people a lot of time to get to know him either, which is kind of amazing. And so he gets this news that Tenzing and Hillary have made it. They've done it. And like you said, it's super important to get this news out. England has lost their king. Their queen is being coronated. They're still recovering from World War II. There's a lot riding on this. There's a lot of national pride riding on this. And there is we need to get this story out before somebody scoops us on it. And so Ten Tswewang, he gets the letter and he is going to run for Kathmandu, which is really far. We think of Nepal as being a small country, but he's running. I was looking at it on the map that you posted on your story, and he's running the length of Nepal like horizontally, and it's something like 300 miles. Is that right?
Just under 200 miles.
Wow. So that's like Boston and New York, something like that.
Yeah. It's like 197 miles. And
through mountain ranges horizontally.
Through mountain ranges. It's 50,000 feet vertically, which is there are 200-mile ultra runs. I don't think there are any 200-mile ultra runs with 50,000 feet of climbing in them. I could be wrong about that. Right? And so, so he was. That was his job, was to carry dispatches. There was a London Times reporter on the mountain with the expedition, and he was writing stories and sending updates back to London all the time. And so he had hired like a half dozen mail runners to run messages back and forth. And he writes the pronouns here are complicated because the reporter was named James Morris, and James did a gender transition in the 1970s and became Jan Morris, and actually quite a famous writer about all subjects, but like known for this scoop of getting the news back to London about Everest. So we chose to use female pronouns in the story. I'm going to say she just because it's like easier to keep track of. But it was he and James at the time, and then for another 20 years or so. But so she had hired these male runners, and Ten Tswewang was one of them, and she wrote a book about this called Coronation Everest, sort of about the process of getting the story back to London, and all of the kind of like deception and hiding it from the other reporters that were in the area. And the only real mention or description that she gives of any of the male runners is about Ten Tswewang. And she says, like, I had saved the best of the male runners for these last messages, like the really important ones I was giving to like my best guys. And the other thing was just like, she says they were running back and forth. So they would be expected to run from base camp all the way to Kathmandu, deliver their message, and then pick up any messages that the newspaper had sent back to Kathmandu and run them back to base camp. So, we say the route is 200 miles, but it's a 400-mile run.
Right. Which is like you run it from Boston to New York, you pick up something, and then you run that to Baltimore. Right. Yeah. Like that's the distances we're talking about here. Except not through like the flatlands of the mid-Atlantic, through like literally the Himalayas. Yeah. Through the Grand Canyon, back and forth. Yeah.
And so, we found one of the great things that we found in Namche was a note that was like a letter of recommendation from the 1953 expedition that said that Ten Tswewang had run this route back and forth 3 times in service of the expedition. And so it was like, wow. He will maybe get more work as a male runner for future expeditions because, it's sort of an endorsement that says he did this, he was great, hire him.
Yeah. 3 times over the course of the expedition. So that would have been a couple of months, maybe 2 months.
1 month, probably.
Wow. 1 month.
Maybe a little longer, like maybe 5 weeks. But I think they got there in like kind of mid-April. And they Jan Morris would not have had any messages to send until they were kind of like working their way up the mountain. So we can kind of assume that the male runners didn't really go until they were climbing. So like in the mid-April time. So that's 400 miles each time he did the trip. So like he was running 200 miles with a really important message, but they were like, but when he got to Kathmandu, that was going to be 1,000 miles of running for the expedition. And then he had to turn around and walk home, back 200 miles home. And the first version of the story that I got was like, he delivered this message and collapsed and died immediately. And I'm like, oh my God, that is the story of Marathon, right?
Yeah, it's like Marathon, yeah.
The Greek, essentially, like that's just become kind of, we commemorate it with all these races that people run. 26.2 miles like is a marathon based on that thing. Yeah. And like, here's this guy who did something kind of bigger and crazier and like has been completely lost to the historical record. Like in Coronation Everest, in the book that Morris wrote, none of the male runners are mentioned by name. And like, that's in part because Sherpa names are kind of confusing. Like they are days of the week mostly. And then the last name is just sort of Sherpa, or if you're in Nepal, if you're in a different part of Nepal, like, Sherpa is the name of the tribe, but there's other tribes, Magar, Tamang, Rai, like your last name is just the name of your tribe. And then your name would just be like, Monday, German or something, whatever your heritage is. Yeah. So it's like, it's confusing. And so they just kind of like, it's easier if we don't even try. Like, well, let's not even write their names down. There are exceptions to this rule. But like for the most part, it's tough to kind of like keep track of names through history in Everest climbing. And so he was completely lost to history.
But you found him at a house party in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
And then you met his grandson, and then you two decided we're gonna go and we're gonna do this run, and we might not run it the whole way, but we're gonna do this route one way to see on the 70th anniversary to kind of commemorate Ten Tswewang, commemorate Pemba Sherpa's grandfather, to check out this route and to get the story out about this guy who did this amazing thing comparable with like the Battle of Marathon, comparable and like but much more recent and through much more difficult terrain and much farther, to try to get the story out so that people will know it and will know the name Ten Tswewang. And I think that's awesome. And so you guys traveled there and you get to Everest Base Camp and you're going to start the run or the hike.
Yeah. Yeah. The only problem is that we had ascended a little too fast, it turns out. It's not that big a difference from where we were supposed to stop to where we did stop. But it was enough. And I ended up, basically suffering from pretty bad altitude sickness as we were starting out. And so I stopped at Gorak Shep, basically. Like I went a little bit further trying to get to base camp, and then was just like, I can't do this. But
I've heard that just the trek out there is like is as grueling as the climb almost, to just to get out to the base of the mountain.
From Kathmandu to base camp, there was a line from Tenzing Norgay's son in his son's autobiography, and he writes that like it was the trek. The route that Ten Tswewang was running is considered more difficult than the climb from base camp to the summit. Which,
wow.
Yeah, like that's all you need to know right there. Like more difficult than climbing Everest, because it's hot, it's relentless, it just never lets up. Personally, I found Everest Base Camp to be plenty difficult. It was I've done a couple other mountain climbing stories. We went to Bolivia and was up at 19,000 feet, 20,000 feet for a couple days, and like I got altitude sickness there. This was worse. For whatever reason, my oxygen saturation, you can measure it with that little thing on your finger. It came back at 57%, which like, if you know what that means, like if you know, like 57% is not like surviving. You're like, at that point you've tipped over, you need to go back down the mountain. You're like kind of slowly dying.
Yeah, you need oxygen in your bloodstream.
Yeah.
I know that 57% is probably not great.
You and I right now are like 98, 99. And like even at elevation, you should be like 75, 80. Like you'll feel plenty bad at 75, 80% oxygen. 57, like it's too low. And I had an InReach, one of those satellite messengers. My wife is an ICU nurse, and I texted her on the InReach, and I was like, here are my symptoms, this is my oxygen saturation. And she's just like, what do you want me to do about it? Like, you got to go down. So I actually didn't get to go to base camp. I didn't make it. Pemba did go start at base camp, so he is like the, as far as retracing the routes, like he is the guy. You can make an argument.
I'm so tempted to like give you a hard time about this, but I really can't do it. I really can't bring myself to do it, because it's like amazing that you got like as far as you did, and the altitude sickness bit is like, I mean, that's going to come into play later too. So, but you guys, you get up as far as you can. You get up, I don't know how far where you got to is from.
Here's the thing. It's not in the story. We looked up kind of we tried to figure out where the British base camp actually was. We couldn't figure it out, but there is a mark on the map that just says historical base camp. And then we know that Gorak Shep, which is the village we were in, that's actually where the Swiss made base camp the year before. And so it stands to reason that the British would have also made base camp there, but we just don't know for sure. So possibly I did make it. Possibly it's fine. We don't even need to talk about me not getting to base camp. But
I think we should count it. You did fly to Nepal to track the story down
with an asterisk. I made the route.
You made the historical base camp. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's call it a win.
Yeah.
And so then you start the hike down, and so we're, I guess, down and up and down and up. And so what was that like, beginning to head out on this kind of adventure?
I mean, it was great. One, it had taken us so long to get to base camp that we were really happy to finally be like, we'd been trekking for I can't remember, 9 days or something, and it was like,
and tracking the story down for 4 years at this point.
And it's like, now we're finally going, like, now everything counts, like, now it's like, think about what this feels like and how this is, and like, this is what Ten Tswewang would have been doing, and so that was really satisfying. After about a day of that, of just like hiking straight downhill all the time, there are a couple big hills between base camp and Namche, but not very many. And then once you get to Namche, it is like really steep, like really, like, kind of like, watch your step. It's so steep. And then you get to Lukla, which is where most trekkers who come to the valley take a helicopter back to Kathmandu and then fly home. You get to Lukla and it gets even steeper. It's like a mud kind of like slick. Like, if it had been raining, you'd have no choice but to like slide down. And we're hiking with 40-pound packs on our back and just like, taking 6-inch steps, like, watch your, keep your balance kind of thing. And we're just like, we do this all day. And, it almost like you spend half a day going down, you get to the bottom, you walk across a river, and then the trail goes just as steep up the other side of a valley.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, because you'd think like, oh, okay, you got to get from Everest Base Camp down to Kathmandu, and you're like, okay, well, it seems like it's all downhill, right? That might not be so bad.
Yeah. Going
the other way might be the hard one, but at that level, you're like basically down climbing a ladder, it sounds like, and then up the other side. That sounds pretty brutal. And it's hot, you said, right?
It's hot. It's like mid-90s. I mean, as we get further in, it gets hotter. We get into June, because it took us 12 days to do this trip. It took Ten Tswewang, our best guess is 5 days. And that's moving. Like the ultra running record for getting from Everest Base Camp to Kathmandu is 3 days. And then the record for going round trip right now is 9 days, just under 10 days. It's like 9 days and 23 hours kind of thing. By the time we were getting towards Kathmandu, like getting into the lower valleys, like it's mid-June, it's getting really hot. Once we get down low and we're kind of bouncing back and forth between these valleys, like that, something really interesting happened that I was not expecting to see and had never heard of before. And that is, Pemba, as we were hiking, he was so strong up top. And as we got down lower, like below 8,000 feet, he would start to slow down. And one night we stayed in a hostel in the town of Karikola, and we were waiting. You show up at these hostels and they're like, "What do you want for dinner?" And we're like, "We'll have a chicken." And they go out and they kill a chicken and they start to make it for you. And it takes a while. And so we're talking, and Pemba is like elbows on the table, slumping down, like can't keep his eyes open. And like, he looks kind of like I did at 17,000 feet. And I'm just going like, what? Like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? He's like, yeah, man, like I just never have any energy down low. It's weird.
So he's not just tired from the run or from the hike.
No, like this is different. This is like something's wrong. And then the next day we go back up, and as we get up above, 8,000 feet, he kind of revives. And he looks better, he feels better, his mood improves, he's making jokes. And, this kind of happens to a lesser extent. It happens on the next valley, and then that effect kind of goes away. So I look into it, and there is actually a thing that happens to Sherpas and anyone that lives at elevation and then comes down really rapidly. And it's almost, in some ways, it's a lot like sort of reverse altitude sickness. This hasn't been studied a ton because it affects so few people. But something happens where your blood just has too much oxygen in it. It's almost like sludgy, or like there's like too many red blood cells. There's the oxygen that they're carrying is like getting in the way, and your heart just has to work really hard to pump it around. And it's almost like your body is like clearing inflammation or something like that. Like it feels kind of like your immune system is working overtime. It's called high altitude deacclimatization syndrome.
Wow.
And yeah,
it's altitude sickness in the other way. But like you said, like the Sherpas, they don't really come down the mountain as often, and so it's probably not that common, like you said.
Yeah,
it's really interesting. I mean, I'm from Florida originally, and sometimes I'll go back there and like the humidity is like crushing, right? I used to live here and I'm from here, but when I go back there, I go back to South Florida, sometimes I can't breathe because the air is so thick and humid and all of that. Like it's interesting how, the different environments. I know it's not the same thing, but it's interesting how certain environments, when you change it, like if you're not from there, the human body gets used to what it's used to, and then a dramatic change of any type can make life really hard for you until you can adapt to it.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because we think of like, Florida is like, it's at sea level or, negative sea level in some places, right? Like it's super low down, and you're like, and if you live in Denver, that's really high up. And like these places are different. And in Nepal, you have Denver's next to Florida's, and they're only a couple miles apart. But because like one of them is so low down and one of them is so high up, you're going through these climates, and it's almost like traveling from Denver to Florida in an afternoon by foot.
We have to take a really quick pause to go to a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll get back into the story. All right, welcome back. Peter, let's get back into it. One thing I loved about your story was you were talking about that, and you were like, yeah, it's like there's different trees and animals and vegetation and stuff on one side on the top of the mountain versus the valley, but you see them both in one day. It's like it's like a Lord of the Rings montage all happening at the same time.
That's a really good image. Yeah. And so because of that, historically, like the different tribes in Nepal, they live at different elevations. It's almost like, you say like a tribe from Florida or a tribe from Colorado, like these are going to be different people. And yes, like in the US, that's how it works. In Nepal, it's like you stick to your height, you stick to your elevation, and like you will be someone that lives at between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. And you don't really go much lower than that, and you don't really go much higher than that.
Yeah, this is a culture kind of similar to, the older, like the medieval Europe, where it's like you don't really leave your hometown. You're from here and you live here, right? And you don't really go out or adventuring or traveling to neighboring towns and stuff.
Yeah. And so as we were doing this hike, in the back of my mind is kind of just like, okay, you have this kind of like mystery here of like, how did Ten Tswewang die? And nobody really knew. Nobody could really tell me. And in one of my interviews before the trip, I'd been talking to Pemba's father, and he was 3 years old when Ten Tswewang died. He didn't really remember it. He didn't know that Ten Tswewang had done the mail run until later in life. And so I asked him how he died, and he just goes, "Oh, it was low altitude sickness." And he's a funny guy. He told all these funny stories in this interview, and I was like, waiting for the joke, like waiting for him to smile and laugh, and he didn't. I'm like, okay, that's a weird phrase. I've never heard of low altitude sickness. And then later he described it again. He like described it the same way. And
then you were starting to see that with Nong Pemba Sherpa while you guys were doing the hike.
So that was happening. I was like, is this low altitude sickness? Is this, the thing that killed Ten Tswewang? And it turns out that what Pemba was experiencing is like, it's noticeable, but it can't kill you. They found that like bee pollen capsules are enough to mitigate the effects of what happens when you live at altitude and come down too low. But we talked to people along the way who described low altitude sickness and how, like, when they were kids, Sherpas didn't come down from the Khumbu Valley after, like, in the summer once it got hot. And people that were from down low didn't really go up during certain times of year. Like, because of the way that different tribes' immune systems had evolved, it would be like, there are different diseases in Florida versus in Colorado. And that makes sense, I think, in our brains when it's like those things are so far away. But
yeah,
it works the same way in Nepal, moving between these elevations. And that's why they didn't really travel between, like, there was
so interesting. Yeah, because we see that with the when the European explorers come to the New World, a lot of people get sick, and they there's all these diseases that they don't have in Europe, and they were a lot of the early explorers here were getting sick from these new diseases. But yeah, like you said, there's distance there, but now when you're going from the flora and fauna and vegetation and bugs from at the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain, there's all kinds of the entire biosphere is different.
Yeah.
And that's amazing.
So it was
really interesting.
It was like common knowledge in Sherpas, like, you don't go below Lukla after May. Like, you just you wait till the fall when it cools down again down there.
But he had an important message to deliver.
He had an important message to deliver. He was being paid an unimaginable sum for Sherpas at the time. I think it was 20 British pounds. But
that's like more money than he was. I mean, that's however many produce runs to Tibet, right? Like,
it was life-changing.
That's a lot of money at the time for that village.
It was life-changing. And then even like those types of jobs over many years, like, you can see it when you're in the Khumbu now, like, and especially doing something like this where, if you fly into Lukla on a helicopter and you hike up and go to base camp or do the 3 passes route or whatever, the kind of like, those are the more popular trekking routes, you're in this kind of like tourist supported economy the whole way. And like, everything's pretty nice. It's Nepal. It's like, you're sleeping on plywood, but you're sleeping indoors. You're sleeping in rooms with doors on them. Once you get below Lukla, and especially once you go to places kind of like in these valleys in between, you are back, I don't know how far in time, 100 years, 150 years. Like, we stayed with a couple at their farm, and their means of cooking, it wasn't like a propane burner or an electric stove. It was a fire that they built in a fireplace that then funneled up into a hole in the top of the fireplace. And they would just like stick, if they wanted to turn the burner up, they stuck more sticks into the open air fireplace. It wasn't even a wood stove. Like, they had built this by hand.
Wow. So you go like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is how it has always been done, right?
They had other things like there were certain parts of, they had glass windows, it wasn't like completely back in time, but like, it was, it's a much different Nepal than I think you get to see for the most part. And there were places that you look back and you're like, this agriculture is being done in ways that it was done 1,000 years ago, with water buffaloes plowing fields and people riding on the plow, and just like the community is out. We were there in planting season, so there were communities that were just out in the fields. And then Pemba and I walk by, and it's like I'm this giant white guy. I'm like 6'5", 200 pounds, and like this cartoon character. And then you have Pemba, who's Sherpa, but he's carrying this like giant telephoto lens. He's a photographer.
Yeah.
So he's carrying these 2 cameras, and he's lived in America for 20 years, so he's like dressed sort of like like the way Americans dress. And so we're looking at us like we were as amazed by kind of like them as they were by us, which is kind of a cliche, but was very
right. But yeah, you've got to make this leg. So normally people would fly by helicopter from Kathmandu to the valley where you would start the trek to base camp. You are walking basically that helicopter route.
Yeah.
What was this leg like? Because I feel like this would be really, for me, this is like probably the most fascinating part of would be like much more interesting than seeing like, here's the tourist place, here's the gift shop, right? Like, you're kind of in the real countryside.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting as an experience. As far as the story went, like, the farther we got from Everest, the less sort of chance that anybody had ever heard. Like, we had a couple of really cool experiences farther away from Everest. They were we had heard like we met people who were young kids when the British expedition, or some of the multiple countries expeditions, I'm sure it's hard to remember kind of who was who, but they remembered the expeditions coming through, because back in the 40s and 50s when folks were trying to climb Everest, they had to make this same trek from Kathmandu.
Yeah, they didn't fly the helicopter either.
They didn't fly the helicopter. And so they would remember these expeditions coming through. And so like talking to them was really cool.
Yeah.
And then we heard rumor of a French guy who had he was on one of the expeditions. I don't think he was on the pre-summiting expeditions, but like he had done this leg in like the late 50s, and he had hiked all the way, and he was now in his 80s and was retracing his steps, and he like remembered where he had been, and he was telling people like, oh, like, I remember this tree in this town square, and like it was only 5 feet tall when I was here, and now it's this giant tree.
Wow.
We never found this guy, and I was never able to track him down, but it was cool to know that we were on the right path. Because the other thing is, like, you think of, okay, you run from Everest to Kathmandu, there must be like a route, and that route is just the route. But as we got farther away from Everest, we got less and less confident that the roads we were following were the roads that Ten Tswewang would have traveled. Pemba's father had said like that he had gone south at this one place where it just didn't make sense for us to go south. Like it was kind of like that would have added like 5 days to our trip. And so we went straight and kind of like went up and over this mountain. And there were other places like, we met people that had never heard of Mount Everest. It was 200 miles, but like in the rest of Nepal, like no one really cares about the Sherpas. They're just like another tribe that exists in Nepal. And the government kind of gets fees from Mount Everest, but if you don't live around Lukla or up high in the alpine places, the tourists kind of like, they skip over you. And so we met a guy who had never heard of Mount Everest. We met people who had never heard of Namche Bazaar, didn't know kind of like what the deal was, like why we were doing this trek. Wow.
And that's wild, right?
Yeah. I mean, we'd be walking on these roads and people would ask, they'd yell at us like, hey, where are you coming from? And Pemba would yell back in Nepali and be like, Mount Everest. And they're just like, what's that? And they'd be like, Solukhumbu. And they're like, oh, okay, Solukhumbu. It'd be like saying, hey, I'm from California. Like, I'm walking here. I came from California. I'm headed to Kathmandu. Like, those are two things people know, but like they didn't know the name of the villages. They didn't know the name of the mountains.
Wow.
Most of them, I'd say most of them knew like Sagarmatha National Park, and they kind of knew what like the area was, but not like Everest just didn't mean anything to them.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And so how long did it take you guys to do the full trip?
From when we left base camp to arriving in Kathmandu was 12 days. We got there. Yeah, I mean, I guess we got there at the end of the day on the 12th day.
How long like every day were you hiking?
From mid-morning, like we tried to get up and get going, and it was just hard. And so like mid-morning until sundown usually, which was like, it was pretty early. I want to say around like 6:30 or 7. So like 8 or 9 hours a day.
On the just hiking straight for not 8 or 9 hours.
Yeah.
Over 12 days.
Yeah.
And then you finally made it. So what was it like to kind of enter Kathmandu finally after having hiked all this way, like 200 miles?
Yeah, we were so like, actually, if you look at the different chunks of this route, like the first part is, all on dirt paths or kind of like rocky paths. And then you get onto like dirt roads. And then the last section, the last third of it is on paved roads. And it's, it's closer to Kathmandu. The roads were literally being built towards Everest as we were walking the other way on them. And our bodies felt fine the first 2 chunks of this, walking on dirt. Once we started walking kind of like for multiple hours on pavement, we fell apart. Like, my feet were just like massive blisters. Pemba had like crazy blisters. Our knees just sort of gave out. Like, everything hurt. It was so hot. We wanted to be just done with this. So on the last couple of days, I think we got up at like 4 a.m. and just started walking and tried to make as much distance as possible. So we did the last third of the route in like 2 days.
Just with a 1,000-yard stare, like,
yeah,
we gotta get there. Let's do this.
Oh my God, like, come on, are we still not there yet? And then, you start to get to suburbs of Kathmandu, and you're like, oh, like, yes, like, it can't be that much further. But then it's like, it's another full day further to get to the part of Kathmandu where we had decided was going to be the end for us, which is this historic district called Bhaktapur, which isn't even as far as the center of Kathmandu where Ten Tswewang would have had to run. So like he was traveling to the British embassy, which is just like, it's too far into Kathmandu. We didn't want to like walk on the roads with that kind of traffic.
Right. Yeah. It's different. Kathmandu is completely different than it was in 1953. So, I mean, that's like,
yeah,
it would be a lot of not fun, like walking,
like honestly dangerous. Like the cars don't care you're there. There's some really interesting historical facts about like, there were no cars in Kathmandu at the time because, or like they were only for, nobility, government officials and stuff, because you literally had to disassemble them and then hire people to carry them over the mountains into the Kathmandu Valley and then reassemble them, like put them back together.
Wow.
And so, in that time, in the 70 years since, those accounts were written to now, it has completely filled in with cars. It was just not a feasible thing for us to make it all the way there.
Sense, right? And so when you got to the historical district, is it safe to say you were not ready to take a note back up to the base camp?
Oh my God, no. Like we went back to Pemba's sister's house we'd been staying, and I think we just like went out to dinner 3 times in a row. Like finish dinner, go eat dinner, finish dinner, go eat dinner again. Cause we were just like completely spent and hot and
you sleep for 3 days. And
just like sapped of all will was how I sort of felt.
Yeah. Wow. And so that was the route that Ten Tswewang took, and he had run it all the way down to deliver the news of the summiting of Everest, which was like the biggest news in mountain climbing history. Then did he go back, or did he die in Kathmandu?
He went back. So his oldest son was 3 at the time that he died. And he's just like, I have one memory of my father. He's sick in bed. Like, he made it back to Namche, and then got sick and died. And, he was saying low altitude sickness was what killed him, which is sort of like, as I kind of like pieced together through talking to people along the route, it's like, there is a thing called low altitude sickness. It just means if you go down too low below Lukla in the summer and you get sick from, it might have been malaria. I can't think of any other tropical kind of like
but he could have brought something. He could have got sick down there and brought something back with him.
It could have been an infection. I mean, he almost certainly like got bit by something or picked up an infection of some kind that he brought back, and then he died. Like there famously there were no doctors in the Khumbu Valley at all at that time, and Edmund Hillary came back and said, hey, you guys don't have any doctors. Do you want me to build a hospital here? Like, thank you so much for all the help that you've given to the British Empire. And they were like, no, we don't want any hospitals. We'll take schools. And so like Pemba, who I was on this trip with, like, he was educated at the Sir Edmund Hillary School in Kumjung.
Oh, that's cool.
Which is just like 45 minutes away from Namche. And then, because of that school, he was able to go to boarding school in Kathmandu, which is where he learned English. And then he was always just sort of like interested in the US. Like, he really liked the US, just kind of like captured his imagination. And so he went to college in Wisconsin. And and then has just, sort of been making a life. He was from then till now, he stayed in the US 20 years. And now he kind of like splits his time between Kathmandu and the US.
Wow.
So it kind of changed his life. Like, it's this like very indirect form of like, because the mountain was climbed, because Hillary made it, Pemba kind of ended up in the US.
Yeah, because Ten Tswewang was on the trip, and he had a little bit of a connection to Tenzing Norgay, right? And I think that's correct, right?
They were friends. I couldn't find any like documentation or like mention of this, but like his son was like, that's why he ran so hard. Was Tenzing Norgay had like risked his life on the mountain. He had made it to the summit, and like Ten Tswewang wanted the world to know that.
Yeah, my buddy did this. Like we did this together. Like we're, let's tell the world, right? We can get this out to everybody on Earth.
Yeah.
I got to get this letter out.
Yeah.
And then just the connection with the success at Everest helped that family, and then his grandson gets to, it sounds like he's doing great. And wow, it's like such an amazing story of this guy running down. He delivers the message. He goes back home, back up the mountain, and then he gets sick and passes away. But his legacy continues in that, like, his son and his grandson ended up being successful, and his town, got some new schools, and it was just kind of this. I don't know, like you said, he had a life-changing amount of money, but the things that he did were also life-changing for his entire village, his entire region, and his tribe and his people, which is just unbelievable. Do you have any? So what you've done? You did the run. You heard the story. You were enamored of it. You had to go see it for yourself. You went out there. You did the rundown. What were your takeaways from the experience? Like, what did you learn from walking this route and walking in Ten Tswewang's footsteps?
Oh man, personally, I don't know that I had a kind of like transformational experience. I think
but a deeper appreciation, maybe.
I mean, yeah, like it's one thing to, and maybe this is relevant to like your show in general, just like Badass of the Week. It's one thing to like read about these like badass survival stories, or it's like someone did something and it like blows our minds because we try to imagine what that would be like. We kind of trying to like armchair adventure and put ourselves in their shoes. It's a totally different thing to like feel that experience like in your bones, in the pain, in your blisters, in your feet, in the like kind of like dehydration and like sunburn that you have, and just like feeling the heat and smelling the traffic, and like the discomfort that you're feeling in the moment of retracing this thing is like, it's a different relationship to the story of someone incredible. And I kind of like, part of me wants to go do more things around the world, like go read. I mean, I know they do this every year, but like you can run the marathon route. And I do think it kind of changed the way I look at these historical stories and kind of like imagining what they would be like versus experiencing what they would be like. And I think there's actually some value personally to doing the thing, even if it's a modern simulation of the thing, but like going and doing the thing, I think it changes your relationship with that story. In some obvious ways, but also in some kind of like deeper ways that are very difficult to articulate. And knowing that like what you're doing, because you have Gatorade and modern footwear and things, like it doesn't even compare to what was happening back then, but it is as close as you're going to get to connecting with someone that you think is incredible.
Someone from the past who did something amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. Peter, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about Ten Tswewang, who was clearly a great unsung badass of Nepali history, of world history. And I really appreciate, I know you're busy. I know you've got a lot of things going on. But I think this story is really important. And I'm really happy that you came on and told us about it. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. This has been really fun. And, I was excited to hear that you wanted to talk, because it's like, you're going to get it. Like, you get it. Your audience gets it. Like, Ten Tswewang is undeniably a badass.
Yes. You get it on a deeper level than I get it, but I got it on the level that doesn't require bug bites and sunburns.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for listening. And we really appreciate it. Please do remember to, if you liked this podcast and you like this type of content, please do like and subscribe it, because that really does help us out. Now, I really recommend that you either listen to the podcast or read the article. You can find it online at outsideonline.com, or you can listen to the entire story of Ten Tswewang via the Outside Podcast, which is available anywhere that you get your podcasts. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you next week with a new badass.
Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larish, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.